Continuing my run-through of the Dick Tracy volumes that my library has, I am now up to the Complete Dick Tracy, Volume 16, 1954 to 1956. So in the description down below, I'll leave a link to the previous videos in this series that I've done, but just to recap briefly. I was interested in the Dick Tracy comics in the early 90s when the movie came out and there was a lot of hype around Dick Tracy. And I had several volumes, graphic novels at the time, which I bought at the bookstores. Some of them were Dick Tracy's greatest hits, like the celebrated case files of Dick Tracy or something like that. And some of them were just companion books to Dick Tracy, which would go through and explain the strip and explain its history, etc. Now that I am back from living abroad, I've decided to try to work my way through the Complete Dick Tracy series, which was not around when I was a kid, but came out sometime in the early 2000s, I believe. Except that my library doesn't have every volume. And unfortunately, my library did not have many volumes from what is considered the peak Dick Tracy period, which is 1942 to 1952. This is when apparently the creator Chester Gould was at his peak creativity, and it's when most of the famous Dick Tracy villains like the Brow and Flat Top and Shaky and Mumbles and all those classic Dick Tracy villains were introduced. So for better or for worse, I guess for worse, I was not able to read through those volumes this time. But I am up here to volume 16, which is picking up right where volume 15 left off. So volume 15 left off right in the middle of the Rughead storyline, and that's where volume 16 picks up and concludes the Rughead storyline and then goes into a few other storylines. But before we get to that, let's just look at the introduction here. The introductions to these volumes are written by Max Allan Collins, who would go on to continue the Dick Tracy strip after the original creator Chester Gould retired. I believe that was sometime in the 1970s. And these introductions are quite interesting. The first volume, the introductions weren't all that great. But by this point, there is a lot of interesting background information and analysis that's given in these introductions. And I might borrow from some of the information in here as I go through and comment on the strips. One of the things he mentions, which I'd never heard about, is that Batman was very much conceived as Dick Tracy in costumed hero drag. So, yeah, I guess there are similarities between Batman and Dick Tracy, as he points out. Both of them have square jaws. Both of them have adoptive sons. Dick Tracy has Junior. Batman, of course, has Robin. I never heard before that Batman was deliberately conceived as a costumed Dick Tracy. Is that true? But anyways, he goes on to mention that one of the differences between Batman and Dick Tracy, of course, is that Batman had a rogues gallery of reoccurring villains. Dick Tracy didn't have this because the Dick Tracy villains almost always got killed off at the end of the storyline. So there was no possibility for them to come back. But one of the things that's going on here in volume 16 is we are beginning to see some of the villains come back. For example, Mumbles is coming back. Now, I'm going to jump ahead to the Mumbles storyline. Mumbles was a villain during the peak Dick Tracy period, the 1942 to 1952 period. And again, I did not read the storyline on this read-through because, my library didn't have that volume. But I think I did read this back in the 90s in the celebrated case files of Dick Tracy or whatever. If I didn't read the whole story, I at least read part of it in one of the books I had. Because I do distinctly remember the ending. Mumbles being lost at sea in a raft. He's paddling it with his oar. The oar breaks, and because the oar is now splintered, it punctures the rubber air raft, and we see Mumbles just lost at sea with the air going out of his raft. I believe that's the last we see of him. But we never see a corpse. So I guess the door was opened to bring him back, and Mumbles is brought back here. There's some sort of reference to this character rescuing Mumbles from the ocean. Yes. Egad, I wonder why I ever saved you from the sea. So I guess, Mumbles must have been saved from the sea by this character. Now, fellow booktuber and commenter Bucky749 left a comment on one of my previous Dick Tracy videos that Mumbles actually goes on to be a reoccurring villain in Dick Tracy. He appears again and again and again. And Bucky749 alerted me to the idea that Mumbles is somewhat like a Batman villain in Dick Tracy. He just keeps popping up again. Even though the ending for Mumbles this time seems to be a lot more definitive. And so he's weighed down by his treasure, which he has tied to his neck. We see him drown, and then we see the body. And we see the body in the morgue. So it looks this time like he is really dead for sure. This time there's the body in the morgue and everything. But if you Google Mumbles Dick Tracy and go to the Dick Tracy wiki, you can read there that sure enough the character does come back again. So I'm not exactly sure how they explain this away. If this was in the Dick Tracy wiki, I don't remember. But I guess somehow they do bring Mumbles back in future strips. I guess that's maybe a few years in the future from this strip here in 1955. The other character who gets brought back, sort of, is Flat Top. Now, Flat Top is another character from the peak Dick Tracy period of 1942 to 1952, who was definitely dead. And again, I read the Flat Top storyline back in the 90s. In this particular reprint selection, my library didn't have it. But Flat Top's son here is brought in. So, Flat Top himself is dead and I guess stays dead. But his son, who looks just like him, comes back and teams up with another one of Dick Tracy's villains. So, this is a way of bringing back Flat Top without really bringing him back. And Flat Top explains, or Flat Top Jr., I guess, explains that he's got a grudge against cops. Yeah. My dad was Flat Top, lived in the same building as those little kids. Don't like policemen any better than you do. So he's got a grudge against them because the police killed his dad. So that seems to be his motive for all of this. So that's the broad overview of this. Actually, a couple more things. I don't remember if I mentioned this in my review of Volume 15, but there's also an afterword, which talks about the politics of the creator, Chet Gould, or Chester Gould. It's as the afterword in Volume 15 was the same, talked about Chester Gould's politics during this time. Very interesting. Chester Gould was a conservative Republican, but he wasn't part of the mainstream Republican Party. He was kind of part of an isolationist pocket within the Republican Party that was resisting the takeover of the Republican Party by the Internationalists. It's interesting. It gets into a fair amount of detail about what the political situation was like in the 1950s. And, I thought I knew my 1950s history, but turns out there was a lot more intricacies and factionalism in the major political parties than I realized. So this goes into it in some detail and talks about Chester Gould's view. I guess the only complaint I might have for this section is they don't do a very good job of tying it in to the stories that we've just read. Like, it would be nice if they would more explicitly connect how these politics were influencing the strips that were in this volume, which they don't really do. But it's an interesting little overview anyways of the political and intellectual life of the creator of the Dick Tracy series. Okay, so jumping back here, like I said, the beginning pages of this picks right up where the previous volume left off with the Rughead storyline. Now, for better or for worse, I guess it appears to be the policy of this particular run or this particular set of volumes that they don't particularly feel the need to wrap up a storyline before getting to the end of the volume. They'll just cut a storyline off in the middle of the volume, and then you pick that storyline up at the beginning of the next volume. But in this case, I actually have read the preceding volume. Usually, in the past, there's been a gap between volumes in my library, but in this case, I know exactly where we are in the story. The introduction notes that Chester Gould is still trying to find a new cute kid character to rival the popularity of Sparkle Plenty. So we've got Wingy here, the adopted sister of Sparkle Plenty, who talks in baby talk. He not like we not like he. Max Allan Collins in his introduction says this is a little grating, and I think I would agree with him. Max Allan Collins also indicates that Wingy doesn't really catch on and is, after this story, going to be headed for comic oblivion, where she disappears into the background and makes very few appearances after this, and maybe that's for the better. So we wrap up the Rughead storyline here. Sorry, maybe I should make one more general comment. I mentioned in my review of Volume 15 that I found it tiresome to read, and I was a little bit worried that this was indicating that now that we were past the peak Dick Tracy period, that these strips would become a little bit tiresome. Volume 16, however, I enjoyed reading. It's not got a lot of great climactic moments like some of the previous volumes. So there's not a lot of really great shocking moments, but there is a lot of twists and turns in the storyline. And as you're reading these strips, you never really know where these stories are going. There's a lot of convoluted stories here that go on a lot of twists and turns. And it holds your attention as you're reading it, just wondering where these stories are going. This was not true of the previous volume, volume 15. In my review of that, I mentioned that volume 15 had some periods where the story just stalled out for pages at a time, which I guess would have been weeks at a time in comic strip time, since these were daily newspaper comics. But volume 16 is much more interesting to read. So, yeah, that's my overarching review of this. Interesting to read. So yeah, we've got the Rughead storyline, which goes through a few twists and turns before Rughead finally meets his end. Then we go to the Mumbles storyline I mentioned earlier. Now, the Mumbles storyline starts off with two feral children, wild kids. They have long hair here, so sometimes it looks like one of them's a girl, but they're both meant to be boys, who are speaking a dialect that nobody understands at first. And we find out later that it's because they were raised by Mumbles. So they're speaking like Mumbles. And it's also mixed in with phrases from South Pacific Island, where they had some of their background. So they keep saying Neki Hoki. And eventually they get a linguist in to... They get a linguist in to try and decipher this dialect. He says, "What about Neki Hoki?" I said, "That's the interesting part. Neki Hoki comes from a South Seas tribe and means almost anything from joy to anger, from hello to farewell." Now, according to the introduction by Max Allan Collins, this is just pure fiction. Neki Hoki was just something that Chester Gould invented. But Chester Gould tries to make this a catchphrase. The characters start saying Neki Hoki. At first, it's just the boys who are saying it all the time. Later, Sam Ketchum starts imitating the boys and starts using that catchphrase. And apparently it was something that Chester Gould wanted to make a thing, but never really caught on. Max Allan Collins mentions that Chester Gould was hoping to make these boys a thing as well. I guess he kept trying to get the next cute kid character. But the boys also did not catch on. And after the Mumbles storyline, they make one more brief appearance at the Christmas card, which is somewhere in here. Dick Tracy gets them out for a Christmas greeting. Let me see if I can find that one. There's a date at the bottom, so it should be easy to find these theoretically. Oh, here we go. So, Merry Christmas, and there's the Neki Hoki kids. And Wingy. And Bonnie Braids and Sparkle Plenty. But apparently I think after this, the Neki Hoki boys drop out as well. So yeah, this Mumbles storyline is a perfect example of what I was mentioning earlier. It doesn't really have any great climactic moments. It just kind of goes on a number of strange twists and turns until it finally ends. But it does go on a number of strange twists and turns. So, again, while you're reading it, you're just... It's easy to keep reading because you're just curious about where the story is going to go next. And then after Mumbles, we get another strange story about a body in a wall. That again leads to a few twists and turns. And we also get the character of Liz introduced. Now, Liz is somebody I had known about from, again, my days as a kid in the early 90s when I had a couple companion books to the Dick Tracy series that were kind of explaining some of the history of it. So Liz goes on to become one of the supporting characters, I guess, in the, from here on out, the late 50s into the 60s and 70s, where she becomes a policewoman who's, one of the main supporting characters. But I didn't realize that this is where she got her origin. So she's introduced as a photographer at the club of one of the gangsters. And her boyfriend is a reporter. And eventually they get married. And I thought I remembered Liz being married to another policeman on the force. And again, this comes from information I got from one of those books I read in the 90s. So I Googled it, and it does look like Liz's first husband, the reporter here, dies at some point in, I believe it's the late 50s or early 60s in a car crash. And so Liz then remarries another one of the policemen. So again, more soap opera elements here in the Dick Tracy land. And if that whole thing isn't soap opera-ish enough, we get a really great soap opera element when it turns out that there's a nightclub singer who is mixed up with some bad characters and who gets shot by accident when a parakeet spooks one of the other characters. And Liz, who is now has left her job as a photographer and is now in training to become a policewoman, when she hears that, rushes to the bedside, where it turns out that, dun 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 dun, this girl is my sister. Yes, she is my sister. I was 10 and she was 11, and we were taken from the orphanage. So here we are really leaning into the whole soap opera aspect of these characters' lives. But there you go. That's what makes the Dick Tracy strip so interesting to try and trace it through the years. Is it's not just simply cops and robbers. There is an ongoing soap opera about the lives of the supporting characters that goes on. Dick Tracy himself, of course, is a very boring character, but the side characters have a lot of points of interest. There's also the character here, whose name is, Joe something, who, according to the introduction, I believe is supposed to be representing the James Dean type teen idol who was becoming popular in the 1950s. So he's a bad guy, but he's supposed to be appealing to the youth, I suppose. And this is where we come back full circle to what I mentioned at the beginning, where he meets up with Flat Top. Liz, by this point, is, I guess, a full policewoman, or almost a full policewoman. But she does make a couple mistakes. She allows herself to get yanked down by her scarf. She does know judo. and is able to take out the bad guy here, but then she gets tricked by Flat Top Jr. So fair enough. Everybody makes mistakes, and she's a rookie. But then she cries about it when she meets Dick Tracy. "Oh, Mr. Tracy, I've been such a stupid dope." And then is still crying about it a couple days later. So, yeah, the fact that she is so emotional over it makes me think that perhaps this is a little bit of a sexist portrayal of a female policewoman. But then, of course, this is the 1950s. And I suppose you could argue it doesn't have to be sexist, right? You could just argue that, maybe this is this particular character and it's not meant to reflect on women in general, maybe. And because, as I mentioned before, these volumes tend to cut off in the middle of the storyline, we cut off in the middle of the storyline. And it looks like the continuation of the Flat Top Jr. storyline is in volume 17, which I think my library might have. So I'm going to see if I can order volume 17 next. And if my library doesn't have volume 17, then I'll just jump to whatever next volume is available. But there we go. That's my review of Dick Tracy Volume 16, 1954 to 1956.